You are now about to witness the strength of street knowledge. Witness the strength. Street knowledge. Street knowledge.
Terrorize the jam like troops in Pakistan.
Street knowledge. Street knowledge. Quick service announcement brought to you in part by Warriors.
Damn, that shit was dope.
And welcome back to another Warrior Creed live stream with me, the radical Majid Nawaz. And today, the topic is Trump's tariffs. As you can see on your screens right about now, Trump tariffs, a great reset against globalism. The title, of course, self-explanatory. We are taking the view here on this week's Warrior Creed that President Trump's tariffs are a severe blow to the globalist agenda, to the agenda of institutions and organizations such as the World Economic Forum, such as central banks and other banking interests. They are a severe blow to the technocrats and to those that are seeking to hollow out domestic markets of each country at the behest of supranational institutions such as the EU, the UN, the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, and so on, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and so on and so forth. This President Trump's severely damaging attack on globalism by raising tariffs the way he has, we're going to get into the weeds of this, is the first time in a long while, in many, many years, for most of Gen X's lifetimes, that's those who were born, let's say, in the 1975 upwards birth years, certainly from what we can remember, this is the most severe blow against globalization that has been witnessed in our lifetimes. You can see again on your screens, there's the title screen, that graph there is the severe drop in April on the FT Standard Index, the FTSE 100. You can see a huge plummeting at the end there on that graph. This is why many banks, globalist commentators, billionaires are up in arms at the moment. You can see in your corporate press dire predictions of recessions, of world economic crash, of trade wars, of China being furious. But as we hope to be able to explain, the exact opposite of what you're being told is what you should believe. This is good news for the individual. It's bad news for the oversized, overinflated state. It is bad news for globalists, their attempted takeover to serve the New World Order, their attempted Great Reset through COVID, in their plan to build a New World Order, which would have been governed by a one world government under technocratic rule. That entire agenda is now in retreat, not least due to the election of President Trump, but also because of his non-stop assault against that agenda. The net result of President Trump's actions in initiating these tariffs against everyone will be a leveling of the playing field and an end to the money laundering and siphoning off of money from individuals, from private and small family businesses into the hands of multinationals, corporates, and supranational institutions. The banks will lose money. The overinflated stock market will self-correct. Over-leveraged interests will be forced to course correct. Imaginary money and paper money printing or quantitative easing and all of the interests behind the imaginary money and the bubbles will all be severely diminished. But the individual, the net result through this, as long as people understand what's going on and do not retreat, but hold the line, the individual beyond this will find themselves slightly more empowered, slightly less impoverished, and they will find themselves, when they look around them, they will find the countries that they inhabit will be a lot more self-sufficient, and manufacturing and production will return home. That will be the net effect of Trump's tariffs. The playing field will be leveled, and ultimately a free trade world order will emerge, but one that is fairer than the one that is currently in place, because it was about time that there was a rebalancing of the world order. And before we get into the weeds, this does require just a brief sentence to explain why. Up until now, what's been going on is we've been living since at least the end of World War II, certainly since the War on Terror and the 9/11 attacks and the US invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. We've been living since the end of the Cold War, at least, in a unipolar world, a world that has come to become dominated by one country alone, and that is the United States of America. Dominated to such an extent that no other country could make any moves if the United States of America did not approve. And the reasons for that were primarily because the US had a monopoly on the money system through the Federal Reserve, and the global currencies of the world were all pegged to the US dollar. And the US dollar, in turn, due to Nixon, in the early 70s, 71, I believe it was, from memory, when he unpegged the dollar from the gold and the Bretton Woods Agreement. And as a result, gold was backed by absolutely nothing except the guarantee of the US state. So the world's currencies were all pegged to the dollar, and the dollar was no longer pegged to gold. And so its value was no longer intrinsic, but rather backed by the US state. What that meant was that the US state had to step in to force people to honor the value of the dollar that they were pegging themselves to their own amounts by the Federal Reserve through paper money printing. If anybody refused to honor that by claiming that this is merely paper and it has no value because it's not backed by gold, the US state would step in and say, well, it's backed by this. And they would have the greatest, strongest military in history to back up the fact that they insisted that their dollar had value. So two things emerged in a unipolar world, certainly since the end of the Cold War. What emerged was the absolute economic dominance of the US around the world, backed by the absolute military dominance of the US around the world. And the US needed to then overextend itself in terms of military power to protect its economic interests around the world, not least the oil reserves, and that's why it's called the petrodollar. Well, what did that lead to? That led to an overreach by the US, a significant decline in the US's image abroad, but it also led to something else very interesting. When the US had no choice but to become a global empire, it had no choice but to then also accept the terms that come with being a global empire. Those terms include exposure to other cultures through migration and erosion of US identity. The minute you become a global empire, just think of the British Empire, especially the British Raj, you are forced as a result to dilute your own culture because you are now governing other cultures. And in governing other cultures, the most effective and efficient way of doing so is not to antagonize them, but rather to coexist with them. And that coexistence invariably leads to a decline of your own culture, of your own understanding of yourself, But it also leads to another thing through trade and through that coexistence and cooperation. It leads to deals being made. And those deals included, of course, through the encouraging of globalization as an attempt to stabilize US interests around the world, in particular US economic interests. Insurrections were no longer of service to a nation that needed to stabilize and secure its economic interests around the world. So it initiated trade. Now, of course, the trade it initiated would be on unfavorable terms because it would be non-reciprocal in order to achieve the stability that the US required. So it was giving, in other words, more benefit to those trading nations than it was taking. And the quid pro quo was, at least they're not revolting against our key economic interests. And that was the status quo up until now. But the reason why that status quo became so unsustainable is because in the end, what that non-reciprocal trading arrangement, and that was stability in return for economic prosperity. So economic prosperity in those regions that the US required a presence. Just think Africa, Asia, the Middle East. Economic growth in those regions in return for them not revolting against US interests, in other words, stability. So we'll transfer some of our wealth to you, and in return, we expect you not to challenge our interests by revolting against us where we have our economic interests in your lands. That became unsustainable because eventually, once left for too long, it led to a hollowing out of domestic industries across the West. We witness this in our own lifetimes. We all feel it. A complete and utter decline of manufacturing power, a complete and utter destruction of domestic culture, of demographics, and an erosion of national identity. And in the end, a decline of economic wealth domestically, with a rise in crime and an increase in prices, in particular housing prices, everything that people in the West are already feeling. So that brings us to the point as to why it was unsustainable. The globalist solution to the crossroads we found ourselves came in the form of their global palace coup, attempted through COVID, an attempt to recognize the unsustainable status quo and instead clamp down and ditch the nation state, recognizing that their economic interests were now dotted all around the world due to empire, ditch their interest in the nation state and attempt to consolidate their power through globalism, merging technology with a centralized form of government, allowing money and their capital to move around the world wherever their interests are. And yes, that would damage the nation state, but they held the belief that the military power, the power of their centralized state, could contain that damage domestically while also administrating it technologically. That, of course, led to the globalists' choice of administration being the technocratic state. In other words, globalists came to this crossroads and realized that the current model post-World War II was unsustainable, and the solution was a one world government under a technocratic tyranny, and to hell with nation states and their domestic populations. As long as you could have absolute control, it no longer mattered. Those wealthy families that were running that project could move around the world anywhere they liked. And you can see how that suited the banking families until, of course, the rise of populism and President Trump seeking to put a brake on all of this. So this, ironically, and the title here is specifically designed to point to that irony, this is President Trump's Great Reset against the Great Reset. This is a Great Reset against globalism, and that's what we are witnessing now. And that's why we're going to now, with that introduction, get into the weeds and explain exactly what's going on. Of course, China, we're beginning on that one. We should explain, of course, in the framework we've just laid out, China was crucial in the model that the globalists adopted to deal with the unsustainable status quo. China being a nation state that had very eagerly adopted technocracy and a centralized form of governance, and of course was the recipient of the economic transfer of wealth to their land, and by providing cheap labor, was able to outsource manufacturing to China, taking those jobs from the West. So China was the leader, or the leading state that was required by globalists to bring about this transformation. President Trump knew that, and that's why the tariffs will particularly focus on China, and China is specifically upset with the move that President Trump has made. And that's why we begin with China. This is a Times of London headline: Trump dares China to blink first. What if it doesn't? And in that article in the Times, we see the following section, and that is that President Trump, to read from it, this is the Times, by the way, today's Times. President Trump has hastened the international showdown that could define his presidency: conflict with China. His threat to levy an extra tariff of 50% on top of the 34% announced on Liberation Day, which was the tariff day that Trump announced it, unless Beijing backs down from its retaliatory measures, amounts to economic shock and awe. A refusal to negotiate further with China suggests a president dug firmly into his tariff trench and willing to take the highest level of risk with the economy to stay there. Now, at this point, of course, you can see there Trump threatening a full-on trade war with China unless they provide a level playing field with America when it comes to tariffs and non-tariff or non-trade barriers as well. At this stage, we should explain what the importance of a level playing field is by demonstrating the state of play as it is in terms of tariffs and reciprocal tariffs by and against the US. And we'll, don't worry, publish all these receipts as usual in the Radical Dispatch tomorrow. But this table, you can see from here, and we'll publish the link to this with all the hyperlinks and everything in tomorrow's Radical Dispatch. But this table shows you reciprocal tariffs by country. There are a lot more countries in the interactive graph than the ones that we're going to print in tomorrow's Radical Dispatch. But if you click on the image, it will take you to the full interactive graph. But these first two that we're going to show you, two tables, are important because of the sum of the countries that are captured in the first two images. The top one there you can see is China. Now, what's important there is you can see in the first column under the heading China, it states tariffs charged to the USA 67%. And in the second one, USA discounted reciprocal tariffs 34%. Now, this is why it's important. Because when you see that first column and it says tariffs charged to the USA, asterisks, the asterisks there represents something that in President Trump's argument, his point is that for all these years, even if you haven't been levying tariffs against us physically, your non-tariff barriers or non-trade barriers, such as red tape and bureaucracy, or, for example, in the case of China, you have to be a member of the Chinese Communist Party to get anywhere in that country, which immediately compromises any foreign businessman. And so President Trump's point is that all of the non-tariff barriers that you have erected against us, even if formally you don't apply tariffs, make it impossible for us to engage in reciprocal free trade with you. And as a result, in recognition of the fact that your nation has been seeking to increase trade barriers against us through both tariffs and non-tariff barriers, we are now saying that we're going to match that with physical tariffs because it's not a level playing field. And that's President Trump's argument. And by the way, on this point, just to fact check, it is accurate. There are a host of non-tariff barriers that the EU, that China, that any country that has red tape has historically raised against the American market in order to maintain that non-reciprocal relationship, which was, if you remember back to the beginning of this stream, that was security guaranteed in return for a transfer of wealth. In other words, to give you an example of that, in Europe, the US would say, okay, we will, after World War II, we will govern your borders through NATO and protect them and make sure Russia can't encroach on the European continent through physical US military presence through the Marshall Plan in Europe, in return for accepting our empire, in other words, troops, boots on the ground in Europe, that's a US empire, in return for accepting that US military presence in Europe, we will, in compensation, transfer some of our economic wealth in America that we managed to, of course, dominate the scene due to our absolute and total victory in World War II. We own all the necessary resources that we need to around the world through direct physical occupation of our troops. And so we have that economic wealth because we are the victors of World War II. In return for you accepting our boots on the ground in the form of NATO, we will transfer economic wealth to you in the form of the Marshall Plan and so on. And that will increase your living standards. And we, as a result, get stability so you don't revolt against our economic presence. It was always meant to be non-reciprocal. We'll give you wealth in return. You allow us to station our troops there so we don't end up in another world war. As we said, that non-reciprocal status quo became unsustainable, but that's why you're going to see in this graph that when Trump says that all of you guys had, up until today, higher tariffs against us than we did against you, he's factually correct. What we are doing is providing you the historical background to how that came about. But he's factually correct. So if you look at some of these key countries here, look at China, you can see tariffs charged to the USA, this includes non-tariff barriers, by the way, is 67% versus the US's reciprocal tariffs at 34%. The European Union, the second one there, again, very important to understand what's happened here. You can see in the first column, tariffs by the EU charged to the USA is 39%, and the US discounted tariffs in return were only 20%. So Trump's point is this is unfair. But again, you can see even with Vietnam, 90% charged to the USA, including non-tariff barriers, and 46% in return. And you can go down and see Japan, again, uneven. That's 46% versus 24%. And it goes on until you get to countries on the right near the bottom, the third from the bottom. You see, very interestingly, the UK's was only at 10%. And so Trump only smacked an equivalent 10% in reciprocation to the UK. And that's why, because the UK's one, third from the bottom, was already only at 10%. And what we are offering in terms of background analysis to go back to why we've said it was always non-reciprocal since World War II, perhaps a reason the UK's wasn't as distorted as countries such as Vietnam's at 90% versus Vietnam's 90% tariffs against America, including non-tariff barriers, versus America's 46%. Perhaps the reason the UK's wasn't that uneven is because, of course, the UK was never defeated in World War II, was never occupied, and therefore didn't require the same level of security occupation in return for wealth transfer to provide stability. And so this framework, we believe, helps explain exactly why and how we've got here. But if you look to the second image now, we did say there's a lot more countries in this because these were US tariffs smacked reciprocally on the world. We're just showing you two tables with the countries on them. There's a lot more countries than this. But if you look to the second table, the reason we're showing you this one is because here it's important to look at the third one down, Israel. Because Israel's first table there, tariffs against the US, were, including non-tariff barriers, were at 33%. And so Trump smacked to 17% on Israel. And of course, that led to the Israelis being in shock, thinking that they were America's best friend. And Netanyahu immediately flying to Washington, requesting a meeting with Trump at the White House. And of course, that meeting happened and concluded. But again, Trump's point would be that even though the day before he imposed this 17% on Israel, all of these are due to kick in tomorrow, by the way, even though Netanyahu and Israel reduced their tariffs down to 0% in an attempt to fend off that 17% coming from Trump, the Americans' perspective is, doesn't matter. You've still got non-tariff barriers. Even if your physical tariffs are down to 0%, you still make it very difficult to trade with us in terms of non-tariff barriers. And the result is, therefore, an uneven playing field because your bureaucracy, your red tape, your governance frameworks aren't the same, and it leads to the exclusion of many of our products from your market. So Netanyahu attempted to negotiate that 17% down with Trump. He went and flew to the White House to see him, but that did not lead in success. And that's as of today breaking. As you can see here from the AF Post online, Trump says he may not reduce tariffs on Israel because the US already gives them billions of dollars. Congratulations, by the way, he said. That's a lot. In other words, the era of the US propping up its allies around the world in return for security is coming to an end. And here is Trump saying exactly that on video to Netanyahu.
Reduce the tariffs that the government put on Israeli goods, 70%.
On where?
On Israeli goods, the 70%.
Well, we're talking about a whole new trade. Maybe not. Maybe not. Don't forget, we help Israel a lot. You know, we give Israel $4 billion a year. That's a lot. Congratulations, by the way. That's pretty good. But we give Israel billions of dollars a year. Billions.
And keep in mind that Trump has also just announced direct US nuclear talks with Iran. Direct bilateral talks, excluding Israel. And of course, Netanyahu is very worried about that. There is footage online of him and his facial reactions as Trump announces that in the White House. We chose not to show that to you today. It's just a distraction from the main topic on tariffs for this show, but we may well return to that, of course, because that topic of US direct bilateral relations with Iran, nuclear talks to avoid a war, is not going away anytime soon, and it's a very, very urgent and important topic. Moving on, though, on this tariffs discussion, it is why we agree with the financial blog Zero Hedge's take with this headline: when Keynesians predict a disaster, start buying. Just to read from the first paragraph of that article, I always get excited about a market correction when I read the Keynesian consensus predict a disaster. The same people who claimed massive money printing and soaring government spending wouldn't cause inflation are the ones who know exactly how tariffs will impact aggregate prices. Fascinating. If you remember, all the voices who are screaming the loudest now were the same voices during the COVID lockdown period, trying to convince you all that printing money wouldn't lead to the mass inflation that we now are living through. So take all those voices with a pinch of salt. And the reason you should, just to continue reading from Zero Hedge's blog there, in June 2016, 16 Nobel Prize winners expected higher inflation from tariffs, and it never happened. Furthermore, many of these economists recommended enormous government spending and Federal Reserve quantitative easing in 2020, COVID, stating there were no concerns about inflation. However, this led to the highest inflationary burst in 30 years. Reality showed that there was no inflation in 2016 to 2019, and that the insane printing and spending spree of 2021 led to the current inflationary burst. This happens because many economic experts will always justify all government imbalances and tax hikes, but raise alarm at any tax cut or supply side measure. We should never trust experts that work painfully close to social democrat governments. And the point being made there is, of course, that the loudest voices that you hear that are amplified through corporate media, through your TV, cable news, and also who are not shadow banned and therefore amplified online, those loudest voices who are complaining happen to be the voices that are in those very positions because they've been appointed by globalist governments and they serve their paymasters. So, of course, they provide a distorted image of what actually has been going on. They were the same voices who are complaining now about Trump's tariffs, who are telling you that printing money and in the UK's context, printing it to provide the furlough scheme, giving free money out to everybody for staying at home. They were the same voices pretending that wouldn't ruin and wreck our economy through hyperinflation. And of course, the rest is history. Reading again from that Zero Hedge piece, the final section for you from it. According to fearmongers, tariffs will create an enormous inflation burst both in the US and abroad. These estimates show that Trump's tariffs will be paid by US consumers. China tariffs against the US will also be paid by US consumers, and EU countermeasures will be paid only by American consumers. Quite amusing. If we believe this narrative, Tariffs would be the best news for businesses all over the world. Americans would swallow the cost entirely, margins will not decline, and the world would be happy. It is so ridiculous that it would be laughable if millions did not take their words seriously. Furthermore, according to the consensus narrative, tariffs will cause a global recession if imposed by the US. However, when tariffs are imposed by China or the EU, then it is all fine. When Keynesians predict a disaster, it is unlikely to happen. When the Keynesian consensus tells you that there is no risk, as they did in 2008, run away. By the way, for the uninitiated, Keynesians, the reference there is to demand-side economists. In other words, economists who believe that a larger state that borrows money and then spends money, the state itself borrows and spends money in key infrastructure projects and elsewhere, is the best way to create economic growth. That is the Keynesian model. The classical model, of course, the supply side model, the most famous advocate for which was Adam Smith. They believe in a smaller state, and by reducing the size of the state and by lowering taxes, they believe that by putting more money into the pockets of individual small family businesses and individual entrepreneurs and creatives, that is the best way to generate growth, because individuals are better at spending their money than the bureaucratic state. That debate is, of course, an age-old debate, but that's the reference to Keynesians in that Zero Hedge article. But effectively, the point being is that those voices that are called Keynesians by Zero Hedge, but are essentially government economists appointed by globalists, those voices have a vested interest in being naysayers and in not only forecasting the losses or the failures of Trump's tariffs, but also in precipitating that failure. Hence, this post by DC Drano Online. The biggest short attack in US history happened last week. Wall Street, globalists, intentionally plunged the markets to attack Trump and the middle-class citizens of this country. Remember that. And of course, Zero Hedge has commented on that too. As a reminder, last week saw the biggest shorting on record. Source, Goldman Prime Brokerage. And again, all these receipts we will publish in the Radical Dispatch tomorrow. But the key point to remember here, A, is that globalists will seek to ridicule the effect of Trump's tariffs around the world and claim that they are a failure, but also will seek to bring about their failure by deliberately sabotaging them, because they are the first to recognize that leveling the playing field and returning manufacturing and other industries to the nation state is the Achilles heel for the globalist project, and therefore ruins, if not ends, their plans for a new world order based on a technocratic one world government. So that's why they have every interest in making sure that leveling the playing field through this tariff gambit doesn't work, through Trump's tariff gambit doesn't work. Now, of course, with that, you'll understand that billionaires who are globalists, and you don't get to be a billionaire in the current system that we are currently ruled under, or as some would say, economically enslaved under. You don't get to be a billionaire by playing their game unless, of course, you are already on their side. And so it should come as no surprise that Elon Musk has been critical of Trump's tariffs. And you can see here again from the Times yesterday, Musk promotes free market economics on X. Just going to read an extract for that from that article from the 7th of April from the Times. Elon Musk, a key advisor to President Trump, has shared a video which extols the virtue of free market economics. The Tesla owner, who runs the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, has already called for a zero tariff zone between Europe and the United States in a sign of tension within the US administration. Musk and Tesla have already suffered because of the tariff plan. His company ships several car parts over from China, which faces tariffs of 34%. But keep in mind that, of course, Elon Musk's concern here is his trade with China, because Tesla electric vehicles, and as with all electric vehicles, require certain rare earth materials lithium and so on and so forth, but in particular also requires certain semiconductors and microchips that are these days only made in countries such as Taiwan and China, which causes a huge problem for Musk's Tesla business. And so he's come out, of course, against what Trump's done by calling for zero tariffs between Europe and America and by calling for free trade. Now, free trade is precisely what President Trump is saying that he would be happy with. And that is that if the US tariffs are expected to be dropped back to what they were, then the non-tariff barriers imposed on the US by these other nations should also be completely removed so that there is a level playing field. And it's only with that level playing field can you have free trade. But as we've said, billionaires do not benefit from that. They benefit from the non-reciprocal relationship that has existed up until now, because they get to benefit from cheap labor being provided by countries such as China. And of course, labor being the highest cost in any business, it makes a huge difference on the margins. And this is why call centers began to become outsourced to India. It's why tech companies were outsourcing a lot of their work to places such as China and Taiwan. But of course, not just tech, but also cheap high street fashion, such as Nike, building factories in China for cheap labor as well. These great corporates, very large and powerful and wealthy corporates, were benefiting from the status quo, and the billionaires who head them were benefiting from the status quo. And all of this came at the expense of the domestic market. And therefore, again, it's no surprise that nominally Trump-supporting Bill Ackman, another billionaire, criticized President Trump. Again, this is from the Times yesterday. Trump will cause economic nuclear winter. Hyperbole, mind you, do not take that at face value, because even Ackman is retreating from his hyperbole today. But this is as of yesterday. We put it to you. He's realized the writing on the wall, that this isn't going the way that the globalists were saying it would. This isn't an absolute disaster or a nuclear winter, as Ackman would have you believe. So today he's retreating from it. But as of yesterday, this is what he said. Trump will cause economic nuclear winter. Just to read from that Times article. President Trump has launched a global economic war against the whole world. That's a direct quote from Ackman, right? That will usher in an, again, quote, economic nuclear winter, end of quote, said a high-profile Wall Street financier and Trump supporter. Take the Trump supporter bit with a pinch of salt, as with Elon Musk. Likewise with Bill Ackman. These are nominally Trump supporters. You'll remember that Musk was originally an anti-Trump voice who voted Hillary Clinton in 2016. But to continue from that Times article, reading, Bill Ackman, chief executive of the hedge fund Pershing Square Capital Management, said in a post on X or Twitter that Trump's tariffs were, quote, a self-induced, end of quote, blow to the American and global economy. Ackman, a vocal supporter of Trump during the election, said, quote, by placing massive and disproportionate tariffs on our friends and our enemies alike, and thereby launching a global economic war against the whole world at once, we are in the process of destroying confidence in our country as a trading partner, as a place to do business, and as a market to invest capital, end of quote. To continue reading from the Times, last week, the president announced a baseline 10% tariff on all U.S. goods imports and steep import charges on key trading allies. The effective tariff on Chinese goods is now about 60% after Trump's measures. Trillions of dollars were wiped off the value of the U.S. stocks last week, with Wall Street's S&P 500 index posting its worst week since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. Again, take everything Ackman is saying with a pinch of salt, because this is Ackman today, as Zero Hedge reports this timeline brought to you by my margin clerk. That's a sarcastic reference there to Ackman worrying about his margins and self-correcting himself. So we'll just read what Ackman has gone on to clarify. Some have misinterpreted my thoughts on tariffs. It was quite clear what we just read you. But he says, some have misinterpreted my thoughts on tariffs. I'm totally supportive of President Trump using tariffs to eliminate tariffs and unfair trading practices of our trading partners and to induce more investment and manufacturing in our country. I am advocating for a 30, 60, or 90-day pause before the tariffs are implemented tomorrow to enable negotiations to be completed without a major global economic disruption that will harm the most vulnerable companies and citizens of our country. He means the stock market. But you can see they're already in retreat because, as everybody by now should know, a bet against Trump is a losing bet. President Trump isn't a bull in a china shop, reckless individual acting or behaving capriciously when it comes to world affairs. He is merely the face of a very strong faction of anti-globalists in the US, who, of course, act in this regard, as well as in other cases, with the US national interests and the MAGA base at the forefront of their minds. And so Ackman is beginning to see that he is becoming isolated with his interventions, and that doesn't serve him. And that's, we put it to you, what Musk, of course, the game Musk has been playing up until now as well, when he switched sides to start backing Trump. But to continue with the warnings, it wasn't just billionaires Musk and Ackman that turned on Trump's tariffs. It was also the banks, as you'd expect, because they're the globalists. So here in the Times, you see JP Morgan, the boss of JP Morgan, coming out, headline, "The quicker this is resolved, the better." The head of one of the biggest banks in the world has warned that President Trump's tariffs, quote, "will likely increase inflation and are causing many to consider a greater probability of a recession," end of quote. As if they were worried about inflation when they were printing money during COVID for that entirely unnecessary lockdown and the entirely oppressive and unnecessary COVID mandates for an MMR vaccine, for a quote unquote vaccine that did not work. But to continue reading from the Times, in his annual letter to shareholders, Jamie Dimon, the chief executive of JP Morgan Chase, added that the quicker this is resolved, the better, because some of the negative effects increase cumulatively over time and will be hard to reverse. Dimon said that while the possibility of recession in the US remains in question, the levies would slow down growth. It wasn't just JP Morgan that came out attempting to sour the grapes. It's also Goldman Sachs that said there's a 45% chance of a US recession. Goldman Sachs has raised its probability of a US recession for the second time in less than a week. We won't read the entire section there for you, but again, tomorrow, all of this will be published in the Radical Dispatch with links. And beyond the billionaires and the bankers that were voicing their protest, there continues to be held in states all across the US organized and funded protests, globalist funded protests, ostensibly against MAGA and Trump. So again, from the Times, you can see this yesterday, hands-off protests in every US state against Trump and Musk. Of course, they view Musk and Trump as the same thing. Just to read from that Times article, hundreds of thousands of protesters flooded the streets in all 50 American states over the weekend to oppose President Trump and Elon Musk, calling for an end to a billionaire takeover. Keep in mind that because of the way we've just explained this, this is anything but a billionaire takeover. To return manufacturing home, in other words, to start building things and making things at home again, is anything but a billionaire takeover. Billionaires benefit from infinite supplies of cheap labor and migration providing cheap labor. They do not benefit from industries returning home to provide jobs for domestic markets at rates that are not developing country rates when it comes to wages. But of course, that doesn't matter to those organizing these protests. What matters is stopping Trump. And hence these protests will continue. They're continuing around the US, many of them being funded by globalist interests. Many suspect George Soros' hand in them. But it isn't just billionaires, banks, and globalist funded protests that Trump is up against, but also the EU. And you can see from this Times headline, "Fight Back begins as EU bets markets will force Trump tariff retreat." Subheading, "So far, it has been a phony trade war, but the European Union has cards up its sleeve and is keen to blame Trump for the global stocks rout." you can see there they're attempting to blame Trump, and they have a plan at hand to try and force a retreat. But it's not just the EU. As we mentioned right at the start, of course, China is outraged. They've accused Trump of blaming them. From the Times again yesterday, China, US tariffs are economic bullying. A Chinese spokesman has called US tariffs economic bullying. And in the last paragraph there from that Times on your screen, last week, Trump introduced additional 34% tariff on Chinese goods, bringing the total duties on China this year to 54%. China has retaliated with a series of countermeasures. So China's quite upset. The Times also reports on Russia. Kremlin monitor turbulent oil price slump. The Kremlin has said that the slump in global oil prices is an extremely turbulent and tense situation for Russia. Oil and natural gas sales make up a third of Russia's national budget revenues, and a prolonged decline in prices could harm Moscow's ability to fund its war in Ukraine. Trump, last paragraph there, President Trump has also threatened to impose secondary tariffs on countries such as China and India that continue to purchase Russian oil unless President Putin agrees to a ceasefire in the war, which it will happen. We'll end up with eventually a ceasefire over Ukraine between Russia and Ukraine. And partly you can see these tariffs have the added benefit of increasing pressure for that ceasefire to end war as well. And again, you don't require us to remind you that globalists desire perma-war so they can continue their money laundering and funneling their funds through the military-industrial complex. And Trump's tariffs will have the added benefit of affecting their ability to wage perma-war because, of course, as you've just seen there, the price of oil. And Trump's aware of all of this and has reacted accordingly on his own Truth Social account, posting on the 4th of April what you see on your screens now. Great job, numbers. Far better than expected. It's already working. Hang tough. We can't lose. Suggesting that President Trump understands that this is a great reset against globalism and that he recognizes that the cards are stacked in his favor. It's a dispute that's been brewing decades. You can see from the Times here, Trump's dispute with China is decades in the making. And just to read a quote from that Times article there, 7th of April, but the high-stakes ultimatum to China is on another level because Trump said in the same social media post that all talks with China concerning their requested meetings with us will be terminated. So Trump is holding the line. He's insisting that he's not going to back down despite what the EU is saying, and of course has been explaining on his own social accounts his thinking behind it. Here you can see from Truth Social, we have massive financial deficits with China, the European Union, and many others. The only way this problem can be cured is with tariffs, which are now bringing tens of billions of dollars into the USA. They are already in effect, and a beautiful thing to behold. The surplus with these countries has grown during the quote-unquote presidency of Sleepy Joe Biden. We are going to reverse it, and reverse it quickly. Someday, people will realize that tariffs for the United States of America are a very beautiful thing. Trump there explaining his position. His aim is to force countries to remove their own tariffs and their non-tariff barriers and thereby level the playing field with the US so that there is an equilibrium economically and not a skewed relationship that America has with the world, which is we'll give you our wealth, in return you allow us to station our troops physically in your lands to secure our economic interests, which are really the economic interests of the globalist factions that have been running the US through the Federal Reserve and other institutions since World War II and since the unpegging of the dollar from gold. Trump's aim to force countries to renegotiate the US economic relationship with them has borne fruit. And as the Times reports here, again, from yesterday's Times, headline, more than 50 countries contact the US to get tariffs revised. So Trump's purpose to initiate the negotiations has now worked. To read from that article, more than 50 countries have approached the White House to begin trade talks, President Trump's top economic advisor revealed. Quote, the countries are angry and retaliating and, by the way, coming to the table, Kevin Hassett, the White House National Economic Council director, said as officials attempted to defend Trump's economic policy. I got a report from the USTR, US Trade Representative, last night that more than 50 countries have reached out to the president to begin a negotiation. But they're doing that because they understand that they bear a lot of the tariff, Hassett added. To go to, again, that article, a second segment from that article. Over the weekend, Trump shared a video on Truth Social suggesting that his tariffs aimed to purposefully hammer the stock market in a bid to force lower interest rates. We're going to come to interest rates in a minute. Hassett said on Sunday that the president respected the independence of the Federal Reserve and the administration was not trying to tank the market. He told the ABC News This Week program that the tariffs were intended to push foreign countries to seek new trade agreements with the US that will be better for American workers and ultimately stabilize prices. It is not a strategy for the markets to crash, he said. It is a strategy to create a golden age in America for the American worker. I don't think you're going to see a big effect on the consumer in the US. So you can see that Trump relatively confident that they can win this because, of course, 50 countries have approached them to renegotiate their relationship. Trump relatively confident that this creates jobs in the domestic US market. And so as headlines are beginning to report, such as this one again from yesterday's Times, Trump stock market sell-off deepens as Trump remains defiant. Now, a key part here from this particular article is third paragraph down. Trump inferred he was not worried about losses that have already wiped out trillions of dollars in value from equity markets around the world. And then, quote, I don't want anything to go down, but sometimes you have to take the medicine to fix something, he said, aboard Air Force One, as he returned from a weekend of golf in Florida on Sunday. And that's a key line there. Sometimes you have to take the medicine to fix something. A short-term pain in Trump's vision for what's unfolding here, so that they can create a level playing field and return to economic growth and prosperity. Now, the interest rates cut we said we'd return to. So the Times reports here, Trump calls for interest rate cuts. Again, that's yesterday's Times. President Trump has called on the Federal Reserve to cut interest rates. The slow-moving Fed should cut rates, Trump wrote in a post on his social media platform, Truth Social. To continue reading from that, Trump also attacked China as the biggest abuser of them all and criticized Beijing for placing retaliatory tariffs on the US, despite his warnings not to. They've made enough for decades taking advantage of the good old USA, he says. And those interest rates, by the way, will eventually have to come down. And the consequence of interest rates coming down, including some of the other consequences of these tariffs when it comes to economic policy, we're going to come to now. But first of all, just to show you the impact of Trump's tariffs on his approval ratings. And this here you can see promoted by a pro-Trump resource online called MAGA Resource, More Winning, : the Daily Mail, and we'll publish all these receipts for you in tomorrow's Radical Dispatch. The Daily Mail shows Trump's approval rating soars after tariffs as America rallies behind MAGA King. In a stunning turn of events, President Trump's approval rating skyrocketed to an impressive 53% this week, surging 4 points from last week's already solid 49%, proving the silent majority is roaring louder than ever. America First Americans cheered as support among black voters exploded by 17 points since last week, showing that the left's grip on minorities is crumbling under Trump's America First agenda. So black voters for Trump and support has exploded by 17 points. Going to now the next paragraph, young patriots age 18 to 29 flooded the Trump train with a jaw-dropping 13-point increase, rejecting woke nonsense for red, white, and blue greatness. Even Democrats and independents couldn't resist the Trump wave, boosting his favorability by 6 points. By Democrats and independents, boosting Trump's favorability by 6 points as they ditch the radical left's sinking ship. According to the Daily Mail, this week's numbers confirm what we've known all along. Trump's leadership is uniting the nation like never before. So that survey where it shows that huge increase in black support for Trump, in young 18 to 24-year-old support for Trump, and Democrat and independent voter support for Trump. All of that comes from this Daily Mail article, which we'll again publish the receipts for in tomorrow's Radical Dispatch. Headlined, Americans deliver shock verdict on Trump's controversial new tariffs. You can see they're dated the 5th of April. Just to read for you from that Daily Mail article from the 5th of April, President Donald Trump is more popular now than before. He sent the global markets into a frenzy by enacting sweeping new tariffs. An exclusive DailyMail.com JL Partners survey of over 1,000 registered voters conducted from March 31st to April the 3rd found that the Republican remains largely popular in the US. The poll found that Trump's approval rating rose to 53%, a 4-point increase over last week when it was 49%. Trump's rising approval rating is surprising, given the flack the White House has received over the tariff order signed Wednesday. It is up by 13 points since March the 7th among those aged 18 to 29. Trump also saw a 6-point increase in favorability among Democrats and independents, according to the survey. The Republican support among black voters skyrocketed 17 points since last week, the poll found. When it comes to Trump's universal 10% tariff on all goods coming in from other countries, more Americans support the policy than those who oppose it. And that, again, as we said, we will publish the links to that article for you in tomorrow's Radical Dispatch. So that's the approval of Trump. As you can see, clearly it's on the up, and on the up among voters that people wouldn't ordinarily expect to be approving of Trump: black voters, young voters, Democrats, and independents. But it's not just the approval ratings that have gone up, but also, again, an effect of Trump's tariffs is that the cost of government borrowing has gone down because government bonds are booming. This is from the Times yesterday. You can see it on your screens now. More than $6 trillion has been wiped off the value of US stocks since President Trump's tariffs announcement. That, by the way, hurts the banks and the bankers. But one asset class that has been booming is government bonds. Investors are dumping equities and parking their money in sovereign debt. In other words, government-issued debt. An asset class which benefits from market volatility, because the most stable thing to explain this, when you're having an economic downturn, the last thing that's going to collapse is going to be the government. Companies will go down first, family businesses, then eventually corporates, but the government remains standing invariably. And so an asset class that remains somewhat stronger, where then people switch their disposable income to, would be government bonds. And so it becomes the government receives a huge influx of money when that happens, and as a result benefits from that status quo. And to continue reading from the Times, investors are dumping equities and parking their money in sovereign debt, an asset class which benefits from market volatility, recession fears, and anticipation of interest rate cuts in the world's largest economies. The yield, which moves inversely to the price of a bond on 10-year US Treasuries, a benchmark for government borrowing cost, has fallen from a peak of 4.8% in January to 3.9%. In the UK, the equivalent gilt yield is down from 4.9% to 4.4%. The gilts rally provided a sliver of good news for the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, whose narrow headroom against her fiscal targets is largely dictated by movements in the bond market. So governments have got wealthier as a result of Trump's move, which provides more money for governments to make sure that they can balance their own books. But also, as we said, we come back to interest. Interest rates are likely to go down. As reported by the Times today, you can see it here. April the 7th, lenders set to slash fixed rates in mortgage price war. Turmoil in stock markets has led to expectations that the Bank of England will cut base rates to avoid economic downturn. To read from the article, banks are expected to cut fixed mortgage rates within days as the fallout from President Trump's global tariffs continues to cause turmoil in financial markets. Read in banks and stocks and shares and in globalist corporations, not necessarily turmoil in government coffers or indeed even in individual family pockets. To continue reading from that Times report on the 7th of April, about 1.34 million homeowners are due to come off existing deals between April and December, according to the city regulator, the Financial Conduct Authority, or the FCA. Many will be coming off 5-year fixed rates taken out when borrowing costs were much lower, so any rate cut would ease the pain of higher repayments. In other words, interest rate cuts mean lower mortgage repayments, which mean more money in the average individual family household, which is a good thing. And of course, now looking at inflation, which is yet to be affected. Again, MAGA Resource reports inflation plummets to 1.22%. Trump's America First plan shines again. Under the leadership of President Trump, inflation has taken a nosedive to an incredible 1.22%, proving once again that MAGA policies are the ultimate cure for America's economic woes. Sources like Trueflation, a real-time data aggregator, reported this jaw-dropping drop on April the 6th, 2025, showing the lowest level since December 2020 when Trump left office. A clear sign that Trump's America First agenda is delivering again big league results. While the crooked Joe Biden's years saw prices soar to a crippling 9.1% in 2022, today's numbers scream victory for hardworking patriots who knew Trump would drain the swamp and fix the economy. The truth is undeniable. Trump's MAGA moves are making America great again, one low inflation rate at a time. Again, keep in mind that's to date. As of today, that's the rate of inflation. Such a volatile situation. We don't know what tomorrow or the day after will look like. Tomorrow is when these tariffs kick in. It is expected to have some effect. Of course, until the situation is resolved, it's going to have some inflationary effect on some goods and services. People are concerned, for example, about the tech sector, Apple, those semiconductors and other rare earth metals that we mentioned earlier, electric vehicles. But then the point being that those companies that they are also companies that have outsourced a lot of their labor and work abroad. And Trump's response to that would be, well, you need to come back home and provide jobs for American workers. And on that point, you can see those industries that are going to be primarily affected. This we've just referenced them. Those big corporates that rely on globalization and foreign trade, therefore, with countries such as China for their semiconductors, their rare earth metals, for their batteries and their microchips. In other words, the tech companies that are H-1B fans, Elon Musk's visa and free flow of migration that they called skilled migration for the purposes of continuing the flow of cheap labor and a socially mobile economic wage slave is what the H-1B visa policies have created. But the companies, the tech companies being primarily responsible for that globalist policy are going to be the electric vehicle companies in particular are going to be the ones that are affected. And we mentioned fashion earlier. So let's start with that. As Zero Hedge reports, tariff shockwave, these apparel brands and retailers most at risk of price hikes. And you can see here, the analysis shows that 7 companies are under coverage. Amer Sports, Shark Ninja, Nike, you see, is one of them, face tariff rates exceeding 40%. And there's a little table there in the image we're showing you. All of this will publish again tomorrow with receipts in the Radical Dispatch. But the key point being here is that all that cheap labor that Nike outsourced to China, with factories on, for example, on land that was ethnically cleansed of Uyghur Muslims by the Chinese state, Nike benefiting from the cheap labor in its factories in China to make clothes and trainers. Nike, of course, had been forewarned that they would suffer in this way, but didn't take that warning during Trump's first term, and so have, as a result, been affected by these tariffs. And that's what Zero Hedge reports. The new data provided by Roach and colleagues on Monday will help consumers navigate the retailers and brands that are subjected to the highest tariffs because their management teams did not heed Trump's warnings in his first term. Reward the companies that have the least exposure to Asia and, more importantly, buy American for maximum cost savings. So it's not just the cheap fashion that's going to be affected, but as we've mentioned many times, electric vehicles and as a result, the entire fraudulent net zero agenda. Yes, that's the companies that pretend they're green while maintaining child slave labor mines in certain African nations and beyond, so that they can continue to mine their rare earth metals for the purposes of, or rare earth minerals for the purposes of their electric vehicles. And so, as the Washington Post reports, a stunning number of electric vehicle battery factories are being cancelled. 4th of April, Washington Post, billions of dollars in clean energy projects have been cancelled since Donald Trump took office. Again, clean energy, when you see that, of course, take it with a pinch of salt. They literally run child slave mines. Continuing on the Washington Post, dated 4th of April, according to data from Atlas Public Policy, a policy research group, more projects were cancelled in the first quarter of 2025 than in the previous 2 years combined. Those cancellations include a $1 billion factory in Georgia that would have made thermal batteries for batteries, and a $1.2 billion lithium-ion battery factory in Arizona. All of that being cancelled. To continue reading. Oh no, we've already read that one. So that's its impact on electric vehicles and the net zero agenda. It may well allow for, even in the UK, Prime Minister Keir Starmer to have the political cover required to cancel the insane net zero policies of the UK, which are having a upward pressure on prices for energy, while therefore making people poorer, while also allowing for a monopoly of the technology required to implement that net zero technology to be owned by countries such as China, because again, back to the microchips and the rare earth minerals that are required to either build the batteries or make the tech. People are finally beginning to get the message, as again, Zero Hedge reports, futures soar on optimism for tariff deals. After 3 days of big losses and record-breaking volatility, equity futures are rebounding sharply, following somewhat soothing comments from Treasury Secretary Bessent. Although how long the relative calm lasts is anyone's guess, given there's little clarity about what Trump wants in exchange for cutting tariffs. So there is some soothing noises being made, but also, remember, tomorrow is when these tariffs are meant to kick in. So there may well be, probably will be, some short-term pain that Trump refers to as medicine, so that the markets can level out, the playing field can level out around the world, and the non-reciprocal wealth for military security arrangement that was made after World War II, as that comes to an end. And again, remember, all of this is to navigate through to the next chapter of human civilization on this planet. We are at a crossroads, and we could have gone, the old model no longer works, the post-World War II model, and it usually lasts 3 generations until the 4th generation comes along to change it, because it recognizes it's unsustainable. It's a natural cycle of history. And so we're at that stage, and we could have gone one of 2 ways. We could have gone down the globalist one world government, new world order, technocratic tyranny route, demolish the nation state and rule the world instead by this new world order, the one world government, and for the interests of corporates. Or we could go to a return of local governments and nation states, which is the populist or Trump or MAGA preferred route. And in that vein, Steve Bannon, we're going to leave you with this, wades in to declare the end of the globalist agenda. Steve Bannon, Black Monday was cancelled. We're going to leave you with this Steve Bannon video, commenting on everything we've just explained.
Monday was canceled. As much as Jim Cramer and the CNBC crowd and the MSNBC crowd, and particularly, Katie Turner, all these people don't know anything about the stock market, never cared about it, but now it's like the most important thing in the universe. The folks that financed the globalists, the folks that financed all the factories leaving, the folks that essentially bet against the American people, the folks that went long other countries and shorted America, they're getting crushed. Americans are doing just fine in a historic day. A couple things. President Trump right there just dropped a blockbuster. Oh, by the way, we're in direct negotiations with the Iranians, or direct talks. Let me know if Denver has a Scott Bessent, the Secretary of Treasury, and as you know, contributor at the War Room for a couple of years. Scott, this is what got things sorted during the day. Talk about process. And remember, these the reciprocity of the tariffs kick in on Wednesday, 1 week after they were announced on the 9th of April. And President Trump says, hey, it's no negotiation. This is what it's going to be. The formula, and this is why people are confused, it's not just the tariff rate. It's all the gaming of the system, the currency manipulation, the counterfeiting, the trying to get around the rules. Also, all the barriers. They put up tons of barriers, not what they call non-tariff or non-cash barriers. As Peter Navarro said, for Vietnam, hey, bro, even if you went to 0, it's not even close to being good enough. And this has come as a wake-up call but they're still stacked up. So President Trump's prepared to listen, right? These are going to be trading partners. He's prepared to listen. But this is a total restructuring of the geoeconomic order throughout the world. And let me just read these two tweets that came out earlier and followed by a third about the Chinese Communist Party. This is Scott Besson early in the afternoon. Following a very constructive phone discussion with the government of Japan, POTUS, real Donald Trump, has tasked me and the U.S. trade rep to open negotiations to implement the president's vision for the new golden age of global trade. And then he is going to do it with the prime minister and his cabinet. So this is direct high-level negotiations. Then Scott Besson followed that up by saying, Japan remains among America's closest allies, and I look forward to our upcoming productive engagement regarding tariffs, non-tariff trade barriers, currency issues, and government subsidies. I appreciate the Japanese government's outreach and measured approach to this process. Another big thing, this is like the Chinese Communist Party, state-owned industries and what they do to game the system with state-owned industries against companies here in the United States that have to compete. All we're looking for is a level playing field. This was followed very closely by China, and this is from the Secretary of Treasury, now in charge of this process. China has chosen to isolate itself by retaliating and doubling down on previous negative behavior. Over 50 countries have responded both openly and positively to the President of the United States, Donald J. Trump. Historic action to create a fairer, more prosperous system of global trade. He looks forward to China getting the message. I think President Trump took tariffs today over 100% against the Chinese Communist Party. It's the folks, the people that are whining are the people that finance the Chinese Communist Party. They've been outed, they've been unmasked, and quite frankly, they've been isolated with the Chinese Communist Party. Hey, if you got a problem with your stocks going down, don't finance the bad guys. And whatever you do, do not short the American worker, the United States of America, and particularly never doubt Donald John Trump. He's coming to this one full on, a total throwdown. And right now, as we end trading on a Monday, it was supposed to be Black Monday. Unfortunately, for the bad guys, that was canceled. Katie Tur, I know you're going to cry great salt tears tonight over all those stocks that didn't drop to the floor. This is completely manufactured as they're trying to use this as another weapon to drive President Trump from office and destroy MAGA. Guess what? 5 days into it, it's the tech bros and the Chinese Communist Party and the sociopathic overlords on Wall Street take.
And as you can see, this fully, we hope, explains the title for today's show. Just as a reminder for everybody there, Trump tariffs, a great reset against globalism. Meant ironically, but clearly also literally, in the sense that this is a reset against the Great Reset. It's a leveling of the playing field, and that should by now be clear for everybody. That's all we've got time for. We'll be back next week for the Warrior Creed live stream, and at the usual time. And as always, the receipts for everything spoken about today will be published in tomorrow's written version of this stream, the Radical Dispatch. Premium subscribers will gain access to the audiovisual podcast and to additional Radical Media content. We thank you all, premium subscribers. Without your work, we cannot continue what we do. And we encourage all those who are listening for free to become premium subscribers over at magicnoise.substack.com. That's all we got time for, but we thank you again for your patience.
You are now about to witness the strength of street knowledge. Witness the strength. Street knowledge. Street knowledge.
Terrorize the jam like troops in Pakistan.
Street knowledge. Street knowledge. Quick service announcement brought to you in part by Warriors.
Damn, that shit was dope.